Hi everyone, my name is Cliff Hudis and I'm the CEO of ASCO. You may notice that this is not the normal introduction for the ASCO in Action podcast. To take you behind the curtain of how we put these shows together, this episode was recorded a couple of weeks ago. After we recorded it, federal right to try legislation was enacted, making right to try the law of the land, even in those states that have not yet passed state-level right to try laws. Now, ASCO remains very concerned about the impact of this law, and we are going to continue to educate our members about what it means for oncologists and their patients. So, even though we recorded this earlier, we still wanted to put the episode out there in full to give you, our listeners, a background on this important topic, even if some of the information is a bit dated. With that in mind, let's get on with the episode.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.
Welcome to the ASCO in Action podcast. This is ASCO's monthly podcast series that explores policy and practice issues with an impact on oncologists, the entire cancer care delivery team, and, of course, most importantly, the patients we care for, people with cancer. My name is Cliff Hudis, and I'm the CEO of ASCO, as well as the host of the ASCO in Action podcast series. For today's podcast, I am really pleased to have with us ASCO's Chief Medical Officer, Senior Vice President, Dr. Richard Schilsky. He's going to be our guest today for a conversation focusing on right to try policies. Now, we've seen growing debate in the lay press as well as in the medical media around right to try laws. And the overall aim of right to try laws is to expedite patient access to investigational new therapies outside of conventional clinical trials, often with minimal or even no regulatory oversight. With that, I want to welcome Dr. Schilsky and thank him for joining me today here to discuss this important topic. Rich, welcome.
Thank you, Cliff. Happy to be here.
Now, before we kick off this discussion, I think it might be useful in just a few sentences to define for our audience two terms. One is right to try, and the other is something that immediately gets mixed in with this discussion, expanded access. What are they, and what is the difference between those two approaches?
Well, you actually mentioned it in your introductory comments. Both are programs that aim to provide patients with serious medical illness access to investigational drugs that have the potential to benefit them. The fundamental difference between the two is the involvement of the Food and Drug Administration to provide regulatory oversight in the process. The Expanded Access Program, which has been in place at the FDA for many years, is a mechanism by which doctors and patients can submit a proposal to FDA requesting the use of an investigational new drug for a patient who has a serious medical illness and no good therapy options. The right to try legislation that has been passed in many states and is pending at the federal level has taken the view that the FDA is something of an obstacle to patients obtaining access to investigational drugs and seeks to provide patients with the opportunity to request access to those drugs without the intermediary step of the FDA review. So that's the fundamental difference between the two programs.
So right now, expanded access in theory is available to any American through conventional, well-established channels, and right to try varies at the state level, as I understand it, right?
Right to try legislation has now been passed in 39 states. There are right to try bills that are pending still in a number of state legislatures. And there are two right to try bills that have passed at the federal level. One was passed in August of 2017 by the Senate. A second, slightly different version was passed in March of 2018 in the House. These have not yet been reconciled. There's not a single bill that has moved forward in both houses. So at the present time, there's no federal legislation on right to try.
And just backing up, are these state-level laws operative right now? Meaning in those, I think you said 39 states that have them, are they now open and running theoretically?
They are. It's not clear that what impact they've had or how many patients might have actually taken advantage of these laws to request access to an investigational drug. I think it's important to point out that right to try is a catchy phrase. It's a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't actually provide patients with the right to try anything. It provides patients with the right to ask for a drug. The key gatekeeper in the entire process is the pharmaceutical company that is the manufacturer of the drug. Both in the right to try laws as well as in FDA's expanded access program, the process really has to begin with first the doctor and the patient making a determination that the patient has a serious medical illness without any standard therapy options available, that there are no potential clinical trial opportunities for the patient, that an investigational new drug offers an appropriate risk-benefit profile for that particular individual. And if all of that applies, then under both right to try and FDA's expanded access, the next step is for the doctor and the patient to make a request to the drug company that manufactures the drug to obtain the drug. The drug companies are not required to make their drugs available under either program, and none of the right to try legislation requires that they do so. In many cases, the drug companies have made a decision not to make their drugs available at this point in the drug's development. So the only thing that the right to try law does, in a sense, is give the patient the right to ask for the drug, but not the right to receive the drug. And I think there's a good deal of confusion about that fact. And therefore, it's not so clear that these laws have really had a great deal of impact.
Well, in fact, there were a couple of points that your description raises. The first is it made it sound as if right to try is a dependent right, meaning conditional on certain other criteria being met. Is that absolutely so? Meaning if you're a candidate for a clinical trial, you are not able to invoke right to try?
Most of the legislation has provisions in it that sort of stipulate that the doctor and the patient first need to make a determination that there are no better therapy alternatives available for that individual, including access to relevant clinical trials. Okay. Of course, there are many reasons that patients don't have access to clinical trials, and not the least of which is that there may not be an appropriate trial, or they may not be eligible for it, or it may not be accessible to them, where they're receiving their care. But in essence, it's easy to check the box on all of those provisions and then move on to make the request for the new drug.
Is there a registry right now of right to try? Do we have a sense yet about how many individuals have actually received any drug under right to try as opposed to expanded access?
I'm not aware that any such registry exists. And so what we have to go on is largely anecdote, and most of the anecdotes that we hear suggest that there have not been many patients who've received drugs under the right to try legislation available in the 39 states where it's been passed.
So before we turn, and we will in a few moments, to expanded access specifically, right to try has become a somewhat emotional issue in the general public. There have been editorials in widely read newspapers and so forth. Can we just put a fine point on it? What is the reason for the deep emotional engagement here? What do we think is driving this loud public debate about right to try?
I think it's pretty straightforward. You or a family member, a loved one has a serious life-threatening illness, no established therapies, a high risk of dying from that illness. You want to explore every option. And if there is a drug that is out there that has undergone some level of clinical testing, that has shown some promise in treating your particular medical condition, it makes sense that people might want to try that drug. I think it's important to keep in mind that most of the right to try laws permit the request for the drug to be made for any drug that has completed phase 1 clinical trials. And we have to remember a few things about what we know about the drug at that point in its development. After phase 1, we know something about its acute toxicities. We know relatively little about what its chronic or delayed toxicities might be. We know something about a reasonable dose that should be studied further, but we don't necessarily know what the optimal dose is for any given person. We usually know very little about how the drug performs in patients who didn't qualify for the phase 1 clinical trial, such as patients who might have varying degrees of organ dysfunction, like a very sick individual might have. And typically, we know very little about the drug's efficacy because it hasn't undergone yet the formal efficacy testing in the later stages of drug development. So there's quite a bit of risk associated with accessing a drug after just the phase 1 trials have been completed. The other thing it's important to point out is that because these drugs, by the nature of the program, are investigational, the patient's doctor is unlikely to have had any experience in using the drug unless they participated in a clinical trial of the drug. So unlike most medicines that doctors prescribe for patients where they have extensive clinical experience with that medicine, for many of the drugs that might be accessed under right to try, the typical doctor has essentially no clinical experience, might not even know the dose, might not know anything about the side effect profile or how to manage those side effects. So there are considerable risks that have to be considered in this setting.
Of course, the families, loved ones, patients will say those risks are trivial compared to the hope that the drug will be transformative for them. Statistically, we know that the chances of that are sadly pretty low, but not zero. And I think that's probably part of the emotional drive here as well.
I think there's no doubt about that. But, let's remember that, even where we have a lot of good data on the success rate for new cancer drugs that enter clinical development, the chances of a drug making it from phase 1 through to phase 3 and then onto the market is 10% or less. So most of the drugs never turn out to have real clinical benefit. And the chances that, an individual who's got a serious, immediately life-threatening illness, will have a truly clinically meaningful benefit from that drug. Most patients, of course, will hope that they'll have a cure from that drug. The chances of that happening are exceptionally small. And I think that it's very hard to argue the emotional drive for these therapies with objective data and logic and the paradigm of clinical development and what are rational expectations. But I think it's important that patients understand, when they undertake any therapy, what are the potential benefits, and that has to be weighed against what are the potential risks.
And of course, as you point out, we don't fully know that in this setting as opposed to a more developed drug. I want to ask, though, one other question about this before we go on to the ASCO policy. This is a partnership in the end. The patient can't actually get and administer most of these drugs without collaboration with their clinician. And it's also worth pointing out that the laws aren't only about oncology, of course. They're about lots of chronic and even acute life-threatening illnesses across the medical spectrum. But what does it obligate? How does it obligate the clinician who cares for that patient? If your judgment as a clinician is that no targeted therapy, for example, is appropriate at this time, but the patient is, in a sense, demanding this, what happens in the physician-patient relationship right now? Do we even know? Is there any legal responsibility for the doc to work as an agent for a patient who wants a specific therapy?
So the right to try laws generally do not obligate the physician to comply in working with the patient to obtain access to a drug. They also offer, in most of the laws, substantial protections for physicians so that they're not liable for bad outcomes that could occur, in a setting where the drug is administered and, of course, doesn't work. So most of the laws protect clinicians from disciplinary actions regarding licensure, protect them from loss of Medicare certification, and have other provisions in place so that the physician is actually protected against liability, and the physician is not obligated to comply with the law. It's important to note that most of the right to try laws, while they include protections for physicians, don't include important protections for patients. Most notably, patients are at risk for paying for the cost of the drugs. They may be at risk for paying for the cost of the medical care associated with administering the drugs. The laws don't include any provisions that require insurance companies to reimburse the cost of those care. So patients have some financial liability under the right to try programs that doesn't actually exist with the FDA expanded access program, where there actually are limits on the costs that can be passed on to patients. The most important risk that patients face in this, again, and I return to the important role that the FDA plays in guiding clinicians toward the best way to use investigational drugs. And if you take the FDA out of the picture, which is the intention of most of the right to try legislation, you miss the opportunity for the FDA to provide guidance to the clinician on the appropriate drug dose to use, the appropriate monitoring for toxicity, the appropriate management for toxicity. Remember that the FDA knows a lot about these drugs because the drugs that are available through these programs are typically drugs that are currently under review by FDA for a potential marketing license. So the FDA has a tremendous amount of data. If you remove them from the process of guiding the clinician how best to use the drug, you remove important protections for patients.
So if I were going to summarize this part of our discussion, it would be at a very high level, I think fair to say that right to try is a little bit of a misnomer. It really is right to ask, no guarantee of fulfillment. It's a right to take on much more risk at the patient level with some protection actually for the clinician, and no assurance that your expenses and complications resulting from care will even be covered. And that may explain why the actual clinical uptake is so much less than all of the discussion would lead one to believe. We believe it's handfuls of patients only that have actually accessed drugs. So I want to turn from that really detailed, I think, and helpful introduction and description to talk about ASCO and what we're doing here. So last year, ASCO became one of the first organizations in a very public way to come out in opposition to right to try. We released a statement on patient access to investigational drugs at that time to try to provide clarity, and we're sensitive to the fact that superficially it could look as if this is in opposition to what the public wants. You know, when people hear right to try, they think this is a noble thing, and they don't understand, in many cases, the subtle nuances that you've already started to describe. So you've highlighted this already, but if we were going to bullet point this, what are the main concerns with patient safety that we have with right to try, and as we described in our statement?
Well, I want to make it very clear right from the start that ASCO strongly supports patient access to investigational drugs. But ASCO's position begins with participation in clinical trials as the best way to provide access to investigational drugs to patients. The concerns about right to try are those that I've described already. The lack of information that may be available to the treating physician about the drug, about the appropriate dose, about the side effects and their management, the omission of FDA from the drug access process so that they are removed from the opportunity to provide guidance to the treating clinician. the financial liability that patients might face in accessing drugs through the Right to Try programs. And again, then importantly, the notion that for many of these drugs, there may not be sufficient information to really provide a good risk-benefit assessment to the patient, even though in the face of severe and life-threatening illness, patients may be willing to accept a much higher degree of risk than is ordinarily the case. It may not even be possible to clearly articulate the risks and the potential benefits just because of limited information about these drugs.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because, of course, in everyday discourse, we hear complaints that the agency and our society is too strict in terms of getting new drugs into market, followed almost within seconds by complaints that we're too loose and we're letting lots of drugs in that have minimal effect and are expensive and so forth. So this argument in the political arena, I think, is part of this discussion as well, and it informs some of it, I think, for the lay audience and our patients. All of that said, we have put a stake in the ground that strengthening, improving the expanded access program is a preferable way to go. Can we talk a little bit about some of the specific steps that have been taken to try to improve the existing expanded access program?
Absolutely. The 21st Century Cures Law that was passed at the end of 2016 includes important provisions that require pharmaceutical companies to make their expanded access policies and procedures publicly known. So that provides a good window into what drugs are available from which companies under expanded access and how patients can access those drugs. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is most of the companies have responded to that requirement by having information available on their website that is not necessarily easy to find, that oftentimes provides very generic information about their expanded access policies, broadly speaking, that oftentimes does not indicate specifically which drugs they're making available under expanded access, but provides a mechanism whereby a doctor or a patient can submit a query to the company to ask about what drugs might be available. So it's not quite as transparent as one might like. Plus, it requires that the doctor and the patient know what drug they're looking for and know what company makes the drug in order to go drug by drug and company by company to find what one is looking for. Nevertheless, those provisions in the 21st Century Cures Law do begin to add a bit more transparency to the process. What's also happened is that the FDA has taken great steps towards simplifying the process by which one can submit an application to the FDA to receive the drug. It's important to remember that when submitting to the FDA, there are several things that have to be included. There needs to be some forms that have to be filled out. There needs to be a short clinical protocol that describes the unmet medical need of the patient, the rationale for treating with the drug that's being requested, the dose that is intended to be administered, and how the patient is going to be monitored for side effects during the treatment. It's also necessary to obtain IRB approval to administer that drug to the patient. And most importantly, you have to submit to the FDA documentation from the sponsoring pharmaceutical company that they're willing to make the drug available. So as I said earlier, it all starts with getting that permission and documentation from the sponsoring pharmaceutical company. The FDA has made a real effort to streamline this process, to reduce the form that's required for submission to a single page, to limit the time that's required to complete the form, to simplify the associated documents that are necessary. And so while it's still not quite as easy as one might like, it's far easier than it used to be. The good news is that the FDA approves more than 99% of the requests that it receives, typically within a matter of days, and can actually approve a request for expanded access or compassionate use within hours if it's a true medical emergency. So the FDA is not the obstacle in patients obtaining investigational drugs, even though it has been made out to be the obstacle in many of the right to try debates.
So I have two questions. I think that's true, and it's absolutely the case. We know their numbers that when the packet gets to them, approval is fast and almost universal. But it's also true that it takes a little bit of time, hours to days, to collect all of that. And so the process still represents a barrier, even if the final approval doesn't. But nonetheless, I mean, these are all arguments for a degree of oversight and understanding so that we continue to learn and protect patients and strike the right balance between access and safety. I understand that. This raises, I think, two questions. One is a small, even trivial one, but you use the phrase compassionate use. Is that a broadly accepted synonym for expanded access?
So expanded access has several dimensions to it, and there are various types of programs that are included under compassionate use. The one that we're talking about today primarily, and the one that has been the focus of the debate in the right to try arena, is what's typically known as compassionate use, or technically single patient IND. Right. So when the documentation is submitted to FDA by the physician, what the physician is requesting is approval to use an investigational new drug, that's what IND means, for treatment of a single patient under the prevailing FDA regulations. Now, there are other types of expanded access programs. A company, for example, can choose to develop an expanded access protocol. An expanded access protocol typically involves the company writing a research study that has fairly broad and simple objectives, limited requirements for data collection, often includes a broader patient population than may have been included in their pivotal clinical trials. And the primary purpose of writing that protocol is their intention to make the drug more widely available, usually during the period of time when the drug is undergoing its regulatory review. Once the drug is on the market, then it's available through the usual prescribing mechanisms. So that's another mechanism. It has been used periodically in the past. Most notably, Genentech used it in during the development of Herceptin, when there was high demand for a drug that was likely to have high benefit for appropriate patients, and they provided an expanded access protocol, and other companies have done that as well. So I think it's important to recognize that there are many parts to the expanded access program, but the one that's been the one that's received the most attention is the so-called single patient IND, or compassionate use program.
I see. So I have a couple of more questions. One is, and this is a short one, many times we hear pushback that expanded access or even right to try are very risky, too risky for the manufacturers, because after all, without the control of a clinical trial, without the required reporting and monitoring, toxicities might develop, and they might even derail an ongoing drug development program or approval process. And while that sounds theoretically possible, has that actually ever happened from expanded use or from even right to try? Do we know of cases where drug development has been thwarted because of these access programs?
Well, I'm not aware of any, and certainly we've heard the FDA say on many occasions that they do not consider information obtained during compassionate use programs as part of their regulatory decision making when they're reviewing a new drug application. So the likelihood that some information that surfaces in an expanded access program would derail the drug approval process is exceedingly low, and maybe has never happened. That said, there are many reasons that a company might choose not to provide their drug through expanded access. The most likely being that they have limited supply, limited manufacturing supply of the drug, because they haven't ramped up their manufacturing until they're aware whether the drug is going to be approved for marketing. Some drugs, like antibodies, require a very complex manufacturing process, and the company may simply not have available supply after they meet the requirements for their ongoing clinical trials to make the drug widely available through expanded access. Other companies are risk averse and just choose not to participate in the program for the reasons that you mentioned.
So earlier when you were talking about the response of many of the companies to the modernization, updating of the expanded access program, you described their increased transparency. It seems to me that one of the things that would be an obvious logical next step would be to have a hosted single registry, obviously, of companies, drugs, availability, and so forth. Do you think we'll get such a thing? Has the FDA offered to put that up yet?
Well, funny you should ask, because there is such a registry available right now. It's hosted by the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. So the Reagan-Udall Foundation, and in full disclosure, I serve on their board of directors. The Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA is a congressionally chartered, not-for-profit foundation whose mission is to support the work of the FDA. They undertook the development of what they call the Expanded Access Navigator, which is available through the Reagan-Udall website. And it is a single point of contact, if you will, for all of the policies available from all of the companies that have made their policies accessible to the public. So one can go on the Reagan-Udall Navigator, one can search by company, one can search by drug, and one can begin to, in one stop at one website, begin to find the information that they're looking for about an expanded access program. One of the challenges in both expanded access and right to try, just to complete the picture, is that neither program collects very much outcome data on patients. Expanded access does require that serious adverse events be reported. Right to try is variable in terms of what their reporting requirements might be. Neither program requires that there be much in the way of efficacy data reported. So although we might learn something over time about how frequently these requests are made, how frequently they are honored, how many patients are treated, under the current provisions of both programs, we don't actually learn very much about what the impact is of the treatment if it's provided to patients. That's an important deficiency in both programs, one that I know FDA would like to remedy, and one that I think they are trying to put some additional resources toward in order to collect that information.
Well, Rich, I want to thank you because I think in a short period of time, you've provided tremendous clarity on an area of great confusion for clinicians and patients in many cases, highlighting the differences between the current and, let's say, upgraded expanded access program and the evolving right to try legislation, which is currently at the state level in terms of implementation, but could become federal law if the houses of Congress ultimately reconcile their bills and pass it to the president. So for all of that, I just want to say again, thank you for joining me today for this ASCO in Action podcast. I want to remind everybody that ASCO is committed, as Rich pointed out, to improving access to investigational drugs for people with cancer. Our first priority is, of course, through clinical trials. The Society will, however, continue to urge Congress to maintain critical FDA patient protections for those seeking investigational drugs outside of conventional clinical trials, and we will try to keep the cancer community informed on the evolution and right to try policies, again, both at the federal level and around the country at the state level. If you would like to learn more about this right to try issue, you can find our statement, ASCO in Action's policy issue brief, as well as an FAQ that members can share with patients even. All of this is on our website at asco.org. And I checked this morning, if you go to asco.org and into the big search box, just type right to try, you will immediately be brought to the resources we described. Also, on cancer.net, you can find information for patients that they can use to navigate the expanded access application process. And I would add that, as Rich points out, they can go right to the Reagan-Udall Foundation website, and there they will be able to find high-level information on expanded access as well. So with all of that, I want to thank Rich and thank all of you for listening. Until next time, this is Cliff Hudis and Rich Schilsky presenting this ASCO in Action podcast.